Hello once again, this is about framing and composition today in film and TV, just like the title says. So let's begin. First of all, we're going to talk about framing conventions. Now, what do we mean by the word conventions? Conventions are potentially a set of rules. It is the normal way of doing things. Conventions have arisen over many decades within TV and film, to the point where there are set sort of standard ways of framing people, subjects, things, and you could think of the conventions as the popular way of doing things. So just in the same way that we have popular music, we also have popular framing that appeals to the masses. You could argue that it's comfortable to look at. That's the reason that these have become the conventions, and also the reason that people generally tend to follow the conventions, because if they're looking to appeal to as big an audience as they can, conventional framing is often a good idea. Of course, as with any rule, I would urge you to consider that it may well be a rule that's made to be broken. However, when it comes to educating and learning about these things, it's important to first of all understand the rules before you can think about breaking them. The term framing, I would argue, is usually referencing a single subject. This is more often than not a person. However, of course, if you're framing something like a bottle for a commercial, then this could potentially also mean an inanimate object in that sense. We'll come on to a little bit later what composition then means, because I personally think framing and composition, although they can be somewhat interchangeable, do have distinctions. They are sometimes used interchangeably, but I prefer to think of framing as a single subject. So to begin with, it's important, especially as a director or as a camera operator, or frankly anyone who's dealing with the visual image, to understand how we can describe shots. To begin with, we use shot sizes, and in the next slide we're going to go through what the typical shot sizes are. Once you've got a shot size, we can then use terms such as headroom and looking space to describe how we want those shots to be adjusted. So as a director, you might ask a camera operator to get a certain shot size, so for example a close-up or a medium close-up. They frame it up, but then because as a director you have a distinct look that you're aiming to achieve for this particular project, you might then say, okay, can I have a little bit less headroom and a little bit more looking space, please? So headroom refers to the space above somebody's head to the top of frame. Looking space refers to whichever way they're looking. We generally tend to leave more space to that edge of frame than we do behind the person. This is referred to as looking space. And of course you can have more or less looking space and it will give a slightly different feel to your shot. When setting up the shot, you can also ask your camera operator to pan up slightly, tilt slightly, or potentially to roll the camera slightly. However, this one is far less likely. It's not often that we roll our camera to one side. These top three are all rotational movements around axes. So if we come over here and have a look at this diagram, the pan rotates around the vertical axis, so imagine a line going up through the camera here. A pan is like a side-to-side motion, you could describe it as if you like, around that axis. The tilt is a rotational movement around the horizontal axis, going through the camera sideways. It's tilting up and down. And a roll is the last remaining rotation around the front to back axis, if you like. As I say, it's not often that we do a roll. A roll is a particularly special kind of move and it's quite hard to achieve smoothly. However, we may well ask a camera operator to roll the camera slightly and keep it fixed in position. This would be called a canted shot, or sometimes referred to as a Dutch angle or a Dutch tilt. So this essentially is throwing the horizon line off level and everything else in the frame also off level. So the top three, as I mentioned, are all rotations around the axes. These bottom three, dolly, boom, /jib and truck, crab, these are all movements along an axis. So these are specifically camera movements as opposed to a way of asking someone to frame. Up here we've got the examples. So a dolly, this is moving the camera in and out along that kind of forward to back axis. A boom or jib is the camera moving up and down. And a truck or a crab is more of a side to side motion. Of course, there might be rotational movement thrown into a truck or a dolly or a boom /jib. So sometimes these things can be put together, but more often than not, keeping shots simple is more effective. You could obviously achieve these shots kind of handheld, but the best way to achieve these is usually with smooth rigs. The dolly, by the way, so this is moving in and out. You might think this is the same as zooming in and out on your camera, but there is a very big difference, and it has to do with focal length. When you zoom, you change your focal length, which means you change the field of view of the shot. You're either letting in more light from a wider angle or a less, not necessarily less light, but your field of view is narrower. So when you zoom in, that's what you're changing, your field of view. And we can discuss that more in the workshop if we need to. When you dolly, you're keeping the focal length the same, unless you choose to change it, of course, but if we're just doing a dolly, we're keeping the focal length the same and we're moving in. Okay, shot sizes then. This diagram I nicked off the internet somewhere. It's pretty good, with the exception of one of the shots, and I'll tell you that when I get to it. So an extreme long shot shows a subject in the landscape. It's a really good sort of establishing shot, establishes where a person is and their landscape together. You'll notice that they're very small in shot, so it's kind of prioritizing the landscape or the relationship between the person and that landscape. The long shot, we're not cutting off any part of the body, so we can see head to feet, bit of headroom maybe, bit of room under the feet as well. Medium long shot is where we start cutting off the body. The medium long shot is not that conventional of a shot to use, but it is often used in old western cowboy films. This is particularly because they would have guns in holsters on the sides of their trousers here, or on their belt, I should say, and it was in order to be able to see these. So this is often known as the cowboy shot. The mid shot, this is where we start to get into the kind of conventional range. So mid shot, medium close up and close up. These are really conventional shots for a lot of TV. The mid shot cuts people off at the waist, and you'll notice that the headroom is starting to get a little bit smaller each time we get closer here. So we're starting to prioritize the head. Generally speaking, we use something known as the rule of thirds, which in this context is to keep people's eyes roughly on the top third of the frame here. So imagine lines going across, a bottom line and a top line here. Keeping the eyes on the top line is a kind of a good way of thinking about it, especially when you get into this conventional range. When you're outside of the conventional range, it's very different, I would argue. A medium close-up then, we start to prioritise head and shoulders, but more specifically we're cutting people off with a little bit of armpit showing here, or if you want to, we could describe that as cutting people off at the nipple. Again, we can start reducing the headroom slightly, and this brings me on to the close-up shot, which is the only shot out of this whole diagram which I dislike, which I wouldn't personally as a director frame a close-up shot like this, because at this point I would start to cut off a bit of the top of the head with my frame. I would keep the eyes higher up. It's a fairly amateurish thing to frame a head and a face in the middle of the shot like this. So I personally think whoever put this together has done mostly a good job, except for the close-up shot. When we get into the realm of the big close-up and the extreme close-up, this is where we start to pick out individual features. So an extreme close-up, although here it's still the features of the face, it could in theory be any feature of the body or of anything really. Big close-up, we can potentially start cutting off a bit of the bottom of the chin, but I would always prioritise cutting off the top of the head before I start cutting off the chin. Dennis the Menace here has got quite a big chin, so it's understandable they've cut off the chin a little bit there. So that's shot sizes. Shot angles, of course, also plays a massive part in framing and in conveying a type of character. So eye level here in the middle is the conventional way to frame people if you're not trying to make them look either powerful or weak. A high angle shot will make people look weak. We're looking down at people. A low angle shot looking up at people makes people look more powerful and more commanding in the frame. All of this stuff kind of harks back to something known as semiotics and also connotation. So the connotation of a low angle shot, think about times in life when you may well have felt nervous because of the presence of someone. Often that person may have been maybe someone who's older or bigger than us, potentially either a school bully or a parent. You know, parents looking down at their children, telling them off might sort of tower over them like this and look down at them and try to make them feel small. And obviously the flip side of this is that character looking very small, looking very helpless and kind of cornered like a small animal or a small child. So yeah, it's important how we angle our camera. I would say, however, the further you go, so the worm's eye essentially is an exaggeration of this low angle shot, it now starts to look a little bit more caricature. It's less like a towering authority figure sort of towering over us and more like kind of like a giant. Like, we are literally a worm on the floor now, and this character is a giant. Probably less threatening to us because we're so small that, they tower over us. So a subtle thing, when you get below a certain angle, it starts to change, and likewise, the high angle shot, a bird's eye, doesn't have the same real feel. I feel like this one's so far detached now that it's kind of loses that same effect. The middle one here, the canted angle, this is what we mentioned earlier. So you roll your camera off axis slightly, the horizon line and everything else goes off level. Often used to make a character seem a bit dodgy, or the situation shouldn't be trusted for some reason. Okay, moving on. These are some conventional interview framings. I would argue they're all conventional, although this one I would suggest has slightly less of a conventional feel because this person here is framed centrally, or near enough centrally. The centre line is probably roughly on this eye here, I would suggest, which leaves a lot of space behind them. So you need to decide as creatives and as camera operators and potentially directors which of these you like the look of and why you like the look of it. I mean, these two here have a nice shallow depth of field, very soft backgrounds, which might seem appealing, but also we need to think about the framing. So these are very conventional. We've got head and shoulders. This would be a probably a medium close-up or a close-up. It's sort of in between the two. Likewise for this one, and likewise for this one. You'll notice we're cutting a little bit of the top of head off on this lady here, and we're leaving a bit of headroom on both of these. They've all got looking space. They've all got a very conventional amount of looking space. They're all framed roughly on the vertical rule of thirds line. We'll touch on rule of thirds a little bit later. I would argue that this space behind here, we could describe this as negative space. It can look a little bit off. I think this shot is okay because there's all this stuff in the background here that obviously relates to this character. So that's another important point to make about when you're setting up interviews. It's a good idea to put your interviewee in a space that kind of relates to them somehow, because the location can also tell you something about the character and the props within that location. So clearly this person here is wearing a lab suit. They work in a laboratory. There is some laboratory equipment back here, so it all kind of links together and tells us something about this person here. Likewise, this lady, we know nothing about this lady, and yet we probably assume that she's either academic or she works in a library or something like that. We don't assume that she's a martial arts expert, for example, or that she is a pilot, I don't know, something like that, because the location is kind of telling us that, also the way she's dressed. And maybe, just maybe, you're also judging her face and how she holds herself and her hair. All of these things, of course, play a part, but as media creators, the things that we can control is the location, the framing, the composition, all of this stuff. So we can also play our part to create characters. Some unconventional framings now. So these are all from, big proper productions, big budget stuff, and they're framed very unconventionally. So I said at the start, these are rules made to be broken, and the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, because these are big productions that break the conventions. I would suggest that these two here, so this top one and this bottom one, are probably second cameras. So it's often typical when you're shooting an interview to set up a main camera that is fairly conventional and a second camera off to one side. This allows you to cut between those two cameras, thus avoiding jump cuts. Very useful technique. You won't always have two cameras on shoots, so you might need to work around that. Often the other way to sort of hide jump cuts is with B-roll or cutaways, but you need to be quite subtle in the way you use that. This framing here is very unconventional. I mean, if a student shot this, I would probably say, I'm not too keen on your framing, to be honest. There's a few things I would say that help them with this particular shot. One, the location is quite fancy, it's quite interesting, it's a little bit unique. It's not just like a boring magnolia wall. I mean, it looks quite plush, it looks fairly rich, almost sort of royal. Also the lighting is fairly nice, it's quite soft around, and it's okay. You can still say you don't like this shot even though it's a proper professional production, and I personally probably wouldn't shoot like this, but there is a place for this unconventional framing as well. Prince Harry down here, speaking of royals, again quite loose framing, lots of headroom, centre framed, lots of negative space back here. It's almost a very loose casual framing to match the kind of loose casual look of this interview setup. He's sat on a sofa, he looks very kind of chilled at home. It's not a royal palace, for example. It's very, not opposite, but it's different to that, let's say. Some more unconventional framings here. Mr. Robot is a classic. This top left one here. A lot of the framing in that TV show is like this, where the main character is sort of pinned in the bottom corner of a frame. Now, I think this is a really good example because Mr. Robot is sort of like an edgy thriller type series, and what I think this does, particularly with this shot, is leaving this negative space here implies that someone is going to step into here at any point. So it's always creating this feeling that you're sort of on edge because something is going on behind this main character's back. I said earlier about semiotics and connotations. Semiotics threads through our language as well. So when we say things like something's going on behind your back, this is how we can imply it in a visual sense. We can literally leave a space here for the audience to imagine what might happen here. If this was a horror film, we would expect the killer to slowly be walking up here with a knife in his or her hand. And I think that sort of works in this kind of framing here. Again, up here, this is the king's speech. In this particular scene, the king is about to have his first therapy session because he has a stammer, and needs to give a speech to a crowd full of people. He doesn't want to freeze up. He's intentionally framed like this to sort of feel isolated against this very cold, dull-looking wall. It's framed in the bottom here, lots of negative space, so it gives that sense of isolation. These two, we can see Netflix in the top corner here, so again, big productions, just very edgy, unconventional framing types, and I think a lot of the time this is just to sort of stand out and to look different to other things. But as long as your location is good and your lighting is good, it can work. Let's move on. What is composition then? So we've touched on framing quite a lot. Framing is about a single subject. I would argue that composition, therefore, is about multiple subjects or multiple items within the frame. They're often used interchangeably. Ultimately, whenever you're framing or using composition to your advantage, you want to be thinking about the mood, the tone, and how it feels. The feeling, I think, is the most important of all those three things. When you look at an image, you need to ask yourself, how do I feel about this image? If you feel fairly if you feel a bit blasé about it, it might be that you're not doing enough with your composition to imply something. And there are tips and tricks that we can use to make sure your composition is implying stuff, is kind of conveying a meaning or a feeling. Ask yourself, why are some shots nicer to look at than others? And a good task you could do here is to set up some sort of composition. Maybe it's a landscape, maybe it's items on a table or something like that, and then take maybe 5 or 10 photos, but from slightly different angles. Don't adjust things too much, because what you want to do is you want to have 5 or 10 very similar looking shots, and then flick through those shots and decide which of those is your favourite and which is your least favourite, and potentially you could rank all of them in order between those two things as well. Doing this should enable you to start thinking about what is it about that particular composition or framing that I liked more than the other one, and why. It starts to give you more of an aesthetic style, let's say, that you particularly like, and understand why. So that's something I would encourage you to do. The size and shape of the frame is always an important starting point, and films and directors literally choose their aspect ratio based on the type of film they're shooting. So two good examples I can think of. The Revenant was shot in sort of this wide cinema scope because it had very vast, sprawling landscapes and they wanted to show off the horizon and everything around. I think it's a film called Ghost Story, I want to say, but I might be wrong on the title. But there was a recent film shot in 4:3 aspect ratio, which is quite close to square, and it gives you this really confined feel, like you're sort of stuck in a box and you can't kind of escape, and it's all very confined in that way. The typical aspect ratio for TV is 16:9. This is also the aspect ratio of your phone. Of course, over here, 9:16, so vertical. It would be the opposite way around. When we're working in 16:9 or any rectangle, there are some kind of like invisible lines that we can imagine going diagonally between the corners that are just inherent in any square or rectangle, and they make a point in the middle. You could then imagine a vertical line from that point going upwards and a line going across here, and that is kind of the starting point of a lot of composition, are these sort of imaginary lines that are inherent in squares and rectangles. I shoot a lot of photos on my phone and upload to Instagram, at Tom Ronstone, by the way, if you're interested in following. But because when I upload them to my Instagram, I use a square aspect ratio, a lot of the time a square aspect ratio leads me to a symmetrical framing. Because the horizontal and vertical lines of a square are equal, it just feels right to put things in the middle of the frame a little bit more. Whereas with rectangular, you've got more horizontal space to play with from side to side than you do vertical, so oftentimes you're better off framing things off to one side, and this is where the rule of thirds often comes in. I've put a circle over here because it's interesting to think about how you would frame something within a circle, because we don't have these lines that connect the corners. We still have a sort of center dot that we could imagine here, so I think again center framing is going to come into play a lot, but what you might end up having to do is build like a frame within a frame to make a circular frame work. I know this is kind of like a little bit wishy-washy the way I'm talking about this, but it is something interesting to think about, is how your aspect ratio and your frame affects the framing composition within that. Okay, so right and wrong, positive and negative. There are a few examples here I've got of particular framings and compositions that you might want to try. Now, of course, I said earlier, these are rules made to be broken, so although this has got a big red cross above it, it doesn't mean you can't frame like this. Of course you can frame however you like. However, there are artists who have worked in the industry, and this particular artist is an animator whose name is on the next slide, who have discovered that framing things in certain ways is generally more aesthetically pleasing. So think about these when you're composing. You know, you put the tree off to one side, particularly as this branch here kind of comes across and over. It sort of leads our eye into the rest of the frame and kind of creates like a bit of a border effect here. Horizon lines generally go lower rather than going through the middle, but again, there might be a reason why you want to put the horizon in the middle. You know, putting things off to one side, as we've already mentioned, and slopes not going literally meeting up with these points, but instead slightly off. The idea of positive and negative space is to do with the empty space around a subject or around a character. These examples here, all of this around this character is negative space in both of these. Just because they've inverted the colours in these particular examples doesn't mean anything. Likewise, this is probably the best example on the screen. The objects, because we're humans, we use language essentially in our minds as we look at things to sort of think, oh, chair, table, vase, window, person. Okay? So those are objects, those are positive things. The rest, the space around these objects, I would say is negative space. And you can have more or less negative space in a composition, and it conveys different meanings depending on how much positive and negative space you have. So think about that when you're framing and when you're also picking locations. Some great compositional ideas here. So this is Mitch Liu, who is an animator, did these ones as well. So check Mitch Liu out on Instagram if you're interested in finding out more. The rule of thirds, this is the really most basic kind of starting point of composition beyond, let's say, just symmetry. And the theory goes that as human beings, we are drawn towards these 4 points that cross over. So we've got these 2 horizontal lines, 2 vertical lines, splitting the screen up into 3. If you put subjects on these crossover points, you can create more aesthetically pleasing images. Aha! The golden spiral. I'm not a fan of the golden spiral. I think this one is a load of bollocks. I've seen loads of images online where there's just a subject that happens to be roughly here in the image, and then someone sticks this golden spiral over it and goes, look, it's the golden spiral. I think that's a load of rubbish. Just because you've put something there does not mean that you've adhered to the golden spiral. Of course, this particular image, because this is just drawn, this animator clearly has put the golden spiral on here first and then drawn a nice image to fit the golden spiral perfectly. So, okay, this image here is potentially the only example of an actual golden spiral used, I would say. Of course, I will eat my words if anyone shows me a nice golden spiral composition and can say, you know, that someone has intentionally used the golden spiral here to compose, then okay, I'll hold my hands up. But until that day, I do not use the golden spiral. Diagonal lines, these are really great for suggesting movement in your shot. A diagonal line is quite an active, energetic thing. In kind of opposition to that, you have horizontal lines, which are generally quite relaxing, and vertical lines, which are quite imposing. If you think again about semiotics and connotation, when I think of horizontal lines, I think of the horizon line in an image. And all the places I go where I can see the horizon are generally very relaxing. So for example, the beach, a nice empty field. If you climb to the top of a mountain and look out, you can see the horizon line. These are all very empty, open spaces. And to humans, I think that means non-threatening because we can see all around us. Vertical lines to me connote inner city, high-rise buildings, very imposing, kind of, you know, blocking you in and maybe blocking out sunlight and that sort of thing. They could potentially also mean big tall trees in a forest, which can also feel fairly confined, but I suppose you could argue that's also a fairly relaxing space as well. But that's kind of the way I think about these things. Pyramids are very strong shapes. We have curves. Any sort of curve is more fluid, flowing, maybe it feels more like nature, whereas this feels like more of a man-made type thing. L shapes, won't go too much into that one, but yeah, it's a nice kind of a border, we could say. This could be like the border into another subject in the middle, for example. Radiating lines, this is a really strong composition and creates lots of depth in your image. You have these converging lines all meeting at a point. Tunnel, so I would probably argue that this is actually called a frame within a frame. So anytime you sort of build a frame, generally speaking, people will look at that. So composition and framing is often about leading the eye around. So in all of these, there is a particular focal point that we want our audience to look at. In this one, it's this window here that we're going into. We've got a few more here that I won't go into in too much detail. The golden section here relates to this golden spiral. So again, personally, not a big fan. Let's move on. Okay, we have C shapes, the golden section. Okay, yeah, it's sort of similar to the rule of thirds, but maybe a bit tighter. This V shape is really strong. Again, loads of depth in that image. Look at that, forcing our eye down here, down these lines into the middle. Okay, I like this idea of balanced and unbalanced cinematography or framing or composition. If you use this as a sort of motif, you can kind of start to build a sense of a relationship between two characters, for example. And over here is actually a good example of that, this size difference. This kind of maybe builds a relationship between this person and these rabbits. Rabbits, as we know, are generally smaller than people, and yet in the frame they're much bigger. So this suggests something about this relationship. It almost feels like these are quite ominous, like they're kind of scary rabbit characters compared to this person. I mean, particularly if this person looked worried. They look quite happy, which doesn't help my theory there. But you can use this particularly with over-the-shoulder shots. So two characters, if you're framing up a character here, and you've got the back of someone's head and their shoulder here, this is called an OTS, an over-the-shoulder shot. The way you frame this person, the back of their head and shoulder, and this person, and the size difference between them tells you a lot about their relationship. And it's often neglected, particularly with kind of amateurs or as you're learning, to think about that relationship. The focal length and the distance between you and each of your characters plays a big part there. We have depth, so this can be created with depth of field, which is basically opening your aperture up wide or using longer focal lengths. Open space, again referring to negative space. And then we have, again, frame within a frame here. So lots of really nice ideas there. So just to kind of conclude, you need to try to create depth in the image. So we want a foreground, a midground, and a background. Think about the layers of an image here. So some sort of interest in the foreground. Midground is often your subject, and then background we want plenty of depth. So try not to put subjects up against blank walls, for example. That's a really common mistake, for want of a better word, that people tend to do when they're first starting out. Generally speaking, just always be conscious of your framing and composition. Don't leave these things to chance. It takes a lot of kind of practice to always be thinking about this stuff as you're shooting, but if you can get to that point earlier rather than later, then that'll be good. Linked to this, try to be conscious of how a shot makes you feel. If a shot is making you feel a certain way, maybe scared towards a character, or, just maybe relaxed, calm, or on edge, or whatever the feeling is that you feel when you look at a shot, it's likely that the audience is also going to feel that. And the best directors in the world are probably the ones who understand their own emotions when they look at something, understand how they feel, and hopefully the audience will feel the same.